Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to have you joining us on this online Bible study. Appreciate our AV people making this happen. Tonight, I am in West Virginia at the Hancock County Revival. It goes to a different church every night. And so anyway, I want to come to you still with our Bible study, and we find ourselves tonight in Genesis 38. So we'll be looking at that. I want to encourage you, like we typically do in our Wednesday night sessions, to mention some things in prayer. We won't do that here, but I hope you're picking up the prayer slips. The goal is, I think you know, that we're putting them in the bulletin, inserting them in the bulletin on the first Sunday of the month, and then the other Sundays, they're updated every week, but they are put in little places, little plastic frames out in the foyer and in the fellowship hall, different places. So I hope you're picking them up and using those, and I hope you will stay in prayer for the people that we mention. But let me jump right into the lesson tonight. I've called this a black sheep in the Good Shepherd's heritage. A black sheep in the Good Shepherd's heritage. Of course, the Good Shepherd is none other than our Lord Jesus, but a black sheep might be, in this case, one of his ancient forefathers, the man called Judah. So we're in Genesis 38 tonight. Let me just jump right to the context, and you, of course, have an outline that you can follow along as I teach on this evening. The Jacob narrative of Genesis has pretty much ended now. It was in chapter 35. Though Jacob will stay alive all the way till just about the end of Genesis. So he's going to still be with us, but he will be pretty frail by the time he moves to Egypt, gives his blessings to his 12 sons, and then passes away. Esau's descendants are in place now. That's the chapter we looked at, chapter 36, and they're going to create havoc for Israel. All those names. You might remember when we went through all those names. So secondly, the Joseph narrative now begins. Well, I say now begins, actually chapter 37. Joseph tells his dad and his brothers about the dreams that he's had, and they said, oh, we'll take care of that dreamer, all right. And they, of course, throw him in a pit. Ultimately, he's sold to the Ishmaelites who go down to Egypt with him, and that's how he ends up in Egypt. And that's a whole other story. But the question is, what is chapter 38 doing? Because if the Joseph story starts in chapter 37, it's going to be abruptly interrupted by the Judah story in chapter 38. Then in chapter 39, we return to the Joseph story. And it has to do with Potiphar's wife making her move on Joseph, who is handsome in form, the Bible says. So how do we explain this odd chapter? That's kind of an interruption. I think we can appreciate it in about three ways. Here's the first. A, Judah's sexual immorality, a.k.a. incest, sets in contrast to Joseph's sexual morality. Joseph flees, even with his father's famous coat in the hands of Potiphar's wife. But that's not what Judah does. Sexual indulgence, in Judah's case, is seen over against the sexual integrity in the life of Joseph. So that's the first thing. Chapter 38 contrasts with chapter 39. By the way, I might just pause here and say, while I was in Mexico for the lectureship there and the convention at Colegio Biblico, I met Patrick. Patrick's one of the professors. He did his PhD dissertation, and I think I've alluded to this before, of how chapter 38 fits with chapter 39. And we, of course, haven't gotten to 39 yet. But that was exactly his thesis, is that basically, if you just look at the individuals kind of at the lower level, not what the story meant to Israel, not what the story meant for God's plan to save the world through Jesus, but at the basic first level, the moral level, it has a contrast between Judah and between Joseph. So we have that. Okay. Also, letter B, Judah's incest took place at a similar time as Joseph's being sold into Egypt. So you could argue it this way. Joseph went off to another land, and Judah did as well. The very first verse of chapter 38. It happened at that time, so the time frame is mentioned, that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. So Joseph is departing by virtue of his brother's, tricks. But also Judah is departing. He's moving away from the Holy Family, as it were. So anyway, maybe there's a timing factor and a geography factor there. And then I want to come down to this. It's actually on your outlines, letter C, that the Judah narrative is actually part of the Joseph story. Really is. And let me just mark that out for you. Reuben, you'll remember, he was intimate with his dad's concubine. To say nothing of Simeon and Levi, who because their sister Dinah got violated, they took their swords and did a number on the people of the land, is not the only evil son of Jacob. Reuben is not, Simeon and Levi are not, and now we'll find out that Judah also contributes to this rather evil saga of the Jacob family. Here's the second thing. The patriarchs continue to make the same mistakes that their forefathers made. Marrying outside the family of faith, committing the same kind of atrocities, lying about their wives, things like that. Just, what goes around comes around. A third thing is Judah starts out bad, but he will improve as the Joseph narrative unfolds. It's kind of a sub-story or a subplot taking place inside of a larger plot. Judah doesn't start out very good. This is a very bad guy. It's like James Smith talking about Joseph. We move from the pit to the palace. Well, Judah starts out bad, but before it's done, he ends up quite good. In fact, he will, along with Reuben, kind of want to save Joseph in a way. And then later, when Jacob tells the boys to go back down to Egypt to get grain, he will give that rather stunning speech to say, we can't go without Benjamin. If you don't release Benjamin, we're not going to be able to go and have success. And then, as maybe his primary speech is not knowing that he's talking to his brother Joseph when he's in Egypt, he actually gives the very redemptive, substitutionary type of atoning speech when he says, look, if we don't take Benjamin back to the father, our father will die. You take me instead. You take me in place of. Well, that was the speech that just uncorked Joseph. That Joseph put all the Egyptians out, and he just broke down in front of his brothers, and he said, I am Joseph. It was Judah's speech that did that. So Judah starts out bad, but he ends up in a good way. And then, of course, this, and we'd have to add this as a fourth item, ultimately, Judah's incestuous relationship with his daughter-in-law ends up in the very genealogy of Jesus. Matthew 1:3. So it just once again underlines the fact that God can redeem anything and everyone. All right, so that's kind of all context. It's all related to these chapters, chapter 36, chapter 37, chapter 38, chapter 39. How does it all fit together? Esau's descendants, 36, Joseph's story starting 37, Judah's little excursus, 38, and then Joseph again, and all the way to the end of the book, Joseph, Joseph, Joseph. Now, I mentioned to you that the title of this lesson is The Black Sheep in the Good Shepherd's Heritage. You know that's how we use this term. The black sheep is a metaphor for somebody who's different from the rest of the group. Looks different. Be Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. That'd be a black sheep, so to speak. It often describes someone who challenges expectations or goes against the norm. And that's certainly what we see in the life of Judah for sure. All right, now that being the case, I've divided this chapter 38 into three parts. And the first is Judah and My Three Sons. My Three Sons. Anybody remember the old television program, My Three Sons? It ran from 1960 to 1972, 12 years. That's pretty good because most TV sitcoms like that last about 5 years. But Fred McMurray, anybody remember Fred McMurray? He was a widower and he was raising three sons. Well, Judah has no TV show, but he did have three sons, whose mother, interesting enough, unnamed mother in the chapter, is an outsider. He took the risk of marrying a Canaanite. Like that hasn't happened before in our story. So let's look at it, the first 11 verses here in the text. 38:1. It happened at that time, I assume that means the time when Joseph was taken down into Egypt, and was spending time in prison there, somewhere in that time frame, that Judah went down. Now, we're probably speaking topographically, although Paul Kissling in his commentary talks about him going down in other ways, going down morally, going down spiritually, going down psychologically. It probably means going down geographically, because where he was, up north at near Shechem, and then he would go up even farther near Timnah, which is north of Shechem, about 14 miles. To go down means he's going off the ridge. There's a ridge that runs up in north and south in Israel, and probably going down means to come off the ridge. And if he's going to be marrying a Canaanite, a Dolomite, family, then it's going to be down by the coast, the Mediterranean. And so going down would mean maybe he's just going west, but going down. It's not necessarily south. He went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira, or Hira. Now, again, he's going away from his brothers. He's committing kind of an isolation thing here. And maybe no crime or no sin, but it can lead to some of those things, which will be part of the application we'll come to later. Verse 2. There, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite. Again, the Canaanites were that umbrella term for all the ites, and they lived over by the coastland, and they were a group of people distinct to themselves, but also many people could be called Canaanites in that world. And it says, whose name was Shua. So Shua is the name of this Canaanite, and he says, he looked at her, the daughter of Shua, he took her and went into her. There's no real mention of a marriage here, unless the took her implies getting married in some kind of ceremony. I think you know what went into her means. That's the actual expression of sexual intimacy. So these are sexual kind of terms. And she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Well, at least at school you wouldn't have to worry about, that being misspelled. At least it's short, that's for sure we can say. She conceived again. Whoa, wait. She conceived and bore a son and called him and she conceived again. How many months of time at least is between those two verses? And one of the things that you read in these chapters of Genesis, sometimes 20-some years can take place in the context of just a few chapters. So you have a lot of months being thought of here. She conceived again and bore a son. She called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son. Again, time, months passing. And she called his name Shelah, or Shelah. Judah was in, I guess you'd say it, Chezib, where she bore him, or when she bore him. Now, it's kind of interesting that good old Judah doesn't seem to be in the delivery room once that, that third son is born. It's almost as if, I don't want to overstate this case, but it looks like he gets more distant in terms of family, the more family that he has. That pattern has been repeated before. So he has my three sons, Onan, and Shelah. Verse 6, and Judah took a wife for Wait. Didn't just get born? Yes, he did. But now he's grown up, and he's old enough to have a wife. And so we've got several years that have passed here. 19, 20, 25 years have passed. So he took a wife for his firstborn. This means the parent is arranging this marriage. And her name was Tamar. She will not be the only person in the scripture called Tamar. We will have that name surface again in King David's family. But Tamar will feature very prominently in this chapter, as will Judah, one of the fourth son of Jacob. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked. Now that's all we know. The Hebrew word for wicked is that same word I've mentioned many times, the word ra. And it simply means moral evil. It's the same word used the first time in the Bible for evil, the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. We have no idea what kind of evil he was, but he was evil. He was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord put him to death. So that sounds like that was judgment on Is there something morally upside down about him? We don't know. We just don't know. Verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, so this is dad talking to son number 2, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Now, this is what's very interesting. The patriarchs are obeying Levitical law before the Levitical law ever came about. Isn't that interesting? This is just kind of goes with the territory. That maybe conscience guided them, then it became law for them later on. But this was something that we'd read about in Deuteronomy 25, that if your brother dies, you are to take his widow and make sure that she is provided for and make sure that the children have an inheritance. Sounds kind of weird to us, but that's the case. But here's what's interesting. Verse 9, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, sounds like he did that more than once, enjoyed the sexual intimacy with his brother's wife, who again is still unnamed, the daughter of Shua, he would waste the semen on the ground. Boy, the Bible is pretty plain spoken at times. The Bible's pretty graphic. And so this is coitus interruptus. This is somehow spilling one seed on the ground, but enjoying the sexual pleasures that have gone with the intimacy. So as to not give offspring to his brother. So clearly later, the original readers of this text would have heard this passage and thought, oh, that violates the law. That's against the law, because they've already had the Ten Commandments and Deuteronomy and all that. Verse 10, and what he did was wicked. Guess what word that is? Same word as earlier. Ra. Wicked in the sight of the Lord. And he put him to death also. Who did? Pronouns refer to the nearest antecedents. So the Lord has struck down two of the sons of Judah, who is in the lineage of Jesus. Interesting enough. Verse 11. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house. She's a widow. Twice, 2 times widow. Remain as a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. Okay, does this indicate that there was and then Onan and then a rather big gap? Any of you have ever had children that were kind of surprise packages? Didn't know we were going to be expecting this late in life. Maybe that's what happened here. Seems like there's quite a distance of time. For he feared that he would die. Oh, okay. It's not time that Judah's so much interested, is that Tamar seems to be killing these boys like flies. And so he wants, make sure that this boy's going to make it, like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. She obeys her father-in-law by going back to her father's house, a 2-time widow. So this is Judah and my 3 sons, if you will. The notes would indicate some things for us here. I already mentioned about number 1. But number 2, Judah went down. That word is significant, not just topographically and geographically, but it's also could be even morally. He's made a mistake. He acquires this friend who is in the Canaanite clan, the Adulamite clan. And this will be somebody that will show up later in the text. Verse 12 and verse 20. Hirah will actually help Judah when he goes to the sheep shearers convention. That will be mentioned. And so, anyway, he marries into outside the faith. And he goes into her and takes her. He's basically following the very bad example of his uncle Esau. He marries outside the faith family. Well, the narrative moves quickly, as you can see. We cover several years here. We've got pregnancies, 3 of them in a row, maybe quite a bit of time between number 2 and number 3. And then they grow up and they're already men and they could be of meritable age. So wow, would take even longer. The name means watchful. Hard to know what to do with all of this. The word Onan the name Onan means strong or vigorous. And the word Shelah actually comes from a verb that sounds like the same word for Moses. I know it's in English, it wouldn't sound that way at all, but it means drawn out, like Moses was drawn out of the water of the Nile. But drawn out is a word that sounds like this particular name. So, is there any significance to Judah not being present at Shelah's birth? It says he was in another city. Maybe it means that Shelah was significantly younger, or because it means maybe Judah is away on business. But there seems to be a growing distance by this dad from his family. I hope I'm not reading too much into that. Judah arranged for the firstborn's wedding, took a wife for and anyway, Tamar is that wife. Her name means palm tree, and she features rather strongly in the narrative. If you look at the backside or the next part of the outline, it will tell you the other things. Was Ra, and what Onan did was Ra. And the purpose, of course, of the Levite marriage was to present the woman, to protect the woman and the child's inheritance. Let me read for you a little section out of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, beginning with verse 5, we read these words. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. Now, that sounds so strange to us. But in these ancient days, two things, that wasn't so strange culturally speaking. And also, it was a way to protect this woman. There was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, no Medicaid. No, this was a way that the woman could be provided for. So you see the tender heart of God there, as well as allowing the children that would come from this union to be protected. And their name could live on, especially if they were boys, they could still have part of the inheritance. And she goes on to say, and the first son whom she bears shall succeed in the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if a man does not wish to take his brother's wife, so there's always but what if they don't want to do this? Okay, God does still provide. If they don't want to do this, then the brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's names in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I don't want to wish to take her, because maybe he would violate his own land rights, that might be part of it. Then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. Now, again, this sounds so strange to us. And yet this was kind of the cultural custom of the day. In other words, you live in a shame and honor culture. This man would be shamed because he wasn't fulfilling his brother's responsibilities. And he shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of the house shall be called in Israel, and the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. Okay, so there is later Deuteronomic law that would give context to this. This is kind of happening before that law is all framed up, but that's the story. Here's what Paul Kissling says on page 442. The patriarchs were obeying the law before the law was given. There was sort of an understanding. Again, God built in the created man conscience, the moral umpire that calls the balls and strikes of life. And we know what's right and wrong. There's a bell that goes off in the head, if you will, something like that. So also know this, that in the ancient world, if all the sons were gone, then the marriage responsibility could pass to the, ready for this, father-in-law. Okay, so the union that we'll see here in a little bit between Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar was not so strange in that ancient world. And maybe Tamar is simply scheming to attain her legal right. Maybe that's how she feels. Well, as mentioned, Tamar has now been twice widowed, and there seems to be confined by her father-in-law to her father's house. And what we have in verse 11 is kind of what they call an interior monologue, because it says, he says to her, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. And then it says, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. That's an interior monologue. That's what Judah is saying in his own brain to himself. I said to myself, self, that's kind of what that is. All right, so we move from Judah and my three sons to incest and pledge. This gets a little ugly. I'm going to just say that, but it is part of the Holy Family's heritage. So verse 12. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Here's this unnamed Adulamite, Canaanite, and she passes away. So Judah has lost his wife. And up to this point, there's nothing that we would know other than marrying outside the faith that was anything wrong with this marriage. When Judah was comforted, maybe he went to grief share. Comforted, this is the idea of he dealt with his grief. Sometimes we don't do that, we pass by it. And he wants us to deal with our grief. So after there's a time of grieving, he went up to Timnah, again, that's a town about 14 miles north of Shechem, to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Harah, the Adulamite. So this is kind of his buddy. He became friends with somebody in the land, if you will. We mentioned this earlier. But maybe now that he's mourned for his wife and he's doing a little better, he's returning to his responsibilities. You will remember that the Israelites were shepherds, which, by the way, I'll just say this now. We'll probably comment on this again when we get down to Egypt. But you remember when finally Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and they were living in Goshen in the land of Egypt because they were shepherds. And the Egyptians didn't have anything to do with shepherds. But partly why God put that together that way is because of cultural indoctrination. If they could maintain their separate community, even though being close to the Egyptians, that would allow them to stay more morally pure. At least that was part of the goal. So anyway, he goes to the sheep shearers convention, and he's up there. Well, when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she jumps into action to try to get fulfilled what should have been her fulfillment in his 3 sons. She took off her widow's garments. I assume that was a cultural kind of indicator that you were in a state of mourning, having lost a husband, in her case too, and covered herself with a veil. Now this is interesting because in the ancient world, prostitutes didn't wear veils. But in this case, she will fake being a prostitute, a cult prostitute, and she will put on a veil. Obviously, she'll put on a veil because she has something she's going to try to accomplish with Judah. So she wants to go incognito. And again, this seems beyond us, kind of like Genesis 29, where Leah wasn't even recognized as Leah until the next day when it came to the marriage situation, so with Jacob. But anyway, she goes up there, she covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance of Enaim. Now, Enaim is kind of a little suburb, if you will, of Timnah. It's kind of by the road, which is on the road to Timnah. So it's just a little place close there. It will be mentioned again in verse 21. For she saw that Shelah was grown up. So again, we've passed several years. If Shelah is the youngest, or Shelah is the youngest, and it's been a number of years since he got to be marriageable age, this is several years. And she had not been given to him in marriage yet. So clearly she's going to try to get her way. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now, again, the historical background I just gave you about prostitutes not covering their face, that was kind of a cultural thing back then. In this particular case, that was a marker. Maybe for Israelite men even. Anyway, and by the way, when we read the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul will tell the women in the church at Corinth to veil themselves when they're praying and prophesying in church. So there you just, one advantage of the Bible being 1,500 years to take to writing it, it shows that customs change in 1,500 years. They just do. And so the veil, was the place of a veil an indicator of a prostitute, or was it an indicator of somebody who was holy and devout before the Lord? Anyway, she covered her face. Verse 16. He turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you. So Tamar's being the deceitful one, but Judah is being the forward one. He is clearly has his, it's been long enough since the death of his wife. He's probably been, he's not been intimate, and now he feels like he has, if you just asked Judah, is incest wrong? He would say, of course it's wrong. But he thinks this is a cult prostitute. So that's not a contradiction in his way of thinking. And you may know, in fact, if you read the context of Deuteronomy 25, which I read earlier, you will see that, if you had a favorite wife, then you can't just whisk away the offspring that would come from the favorite one, or the unfavored one, the unloved one. You can't just do away with that kid. He still deserves the rights. So anyway, there's a lot of play going on here with this stuff in the culture of the time. He said, come and let me come into you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. Oh, ay. Once again, we just say, is this thick veil? What's going on here? There has to be some stuff in between the lines that we just don't know. And she said, she's a wheeler dealer, what will you give me that you may come into me? Okay, cult prostitute, there's a payment to be made, and the payment is, for sexual pleasure, a goat. A goat. That's the answer. He answered, I will send you a young goat from my flock. I mean, after all, it's close by. That's what he brought the goats and the sheep up there for the sheep shearing anyway. And she said, if you give me a pledge until you send it, how about that? So she's asking for his credit card. She is essentially, wanting some kind of guarantee that he will send it. He has no problem with that. He said, what kind of pledge would I give you? She said, how about your ring? Your signet ring, which would be the family ring, which when you put it down on some wax, it would raise the indication of the family, some kind of a clan indicator, something like that, like the brand on a cow. That would be something like we're talking about here. So he said, signet ring and the cord. There was usually a cord that kind of came off the signet ring, and your staff that's in your hand. So these are just things that he would have had with him. She could probably see them. So he gave them to her and went into her. So there's the action. And she conceived by him. I don't know if she knew that she was very ready to be able to conceive when she put this plan in action, but anyway, she conceived. She arose and went away. Taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. So the deception had taken place. This is very much what happens in Jacob's family. Verse 20, when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite, you remember his name is Hira, to take back the pledge from the women's hand, in other words, here's the goat, give me back my stuff, he did not find her. And he asked them in the place, where's the cult prostitute who was at Enaim by the roadside? And they said, there's no cult prostitute here. I mean, this wasn't normal. She didn't always sit out there. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Also, the men of the place said, no cult prostitute has been here. And Judah says, he gets this message and he says, well, all right, shoot. Just let her keep the things of her own or we'll be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat and you did not find her. All right, here's the incest and here's the pledge. Again, I want to stress for you, many years have passed. Judah's wife dies. He takes the time to grieve, but now he is, and I don't mean to be too graphic with this, but kind of sinking sexually again after the time of grieving. He's well enough to go to this sheep shearers conference that's up at Timnah, okay? And Tamar disguises herself to deceive him. Again, some of the background there with the code of holiness. Again, if you ask Judah, is it wrong to have sex with your daughter-in-law? He would say, well, later on, Leviticus 18 will be written. Of course it's wrong. You'd have no problem with that. Judah was against incest, but this is a cult prostitute, so that's different, right? Well, no, not so much. But here's the thing. We sit here over 2,000 years later, way over 2,000 years later, and we make judgments from a Christian worldview. So hear what Paul Kissling says. We must always remind ourselves that Old Testament characters are not Christians and are not typically portrayed as being moral models for Christians or any other sort of reader. So as ugly as this sounds to us, those real clear lines of morality have basically been down the tubes since the flood. That man's every thought and intention of his heart was evil continually. So again, you just got to kind of remember the time frame. Also, I would remind you of this historical piece. Worshippers in the ancient world would often perform sex acts as part of their worship. So if she's a cult prostitute, and by the way, the Hebrew words would put those things together. That's why the more modern translations say both words, not just a prostitute, but a cult prostitute. Somebody who's involved in some kind of religious business. Sex and spirituality have often gone together down through history. So Kissling says, Judah is no example for a nation that was supposed to be a light for the nations. He just was a poor example. Why didn't he know her? I mean, you would think, wouldn't you? Holy cow, you're Tamar. No, not really. As we see in Genesis 29:25, Jacob didn't know, that it was Leah. He thought it was Rachel. So there must be some cultural things about the veil and how they did the ceremonies. That would be Genesis 29. In this case, just the little place where the side stand that they went into, whatever. The payment was a goat, but the pledge took the place of a credit card. The signet ring was attached to a cord, which was kind of the family ID. It'd be like my Scott clan tie that I got in Scotland years ago. The staff was a personal possession. She thought she was in good shape. Not finding her, though, when they went back to give the goat was ironic and forced embarrassment to the foreground. In other words, Hurrah is able to say to his friend Judah, listen, you're going to be the laughingstock. If we keep pressing this, you keep sending me back there, they're going to say, what's wrong with that guy? So again, in a shame and honor culture, that's what you have. Well, the last part of this is the plot and the twins. The plot and the twins. Verse 24. About 3 months later, one would maybe start to show at that point, I guess. Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Actually, this word means has committed some kind of prostitution, if you will, committed fornication. She's gone a-whoring, if you will. Moreover, she's pregnant by immorality. Boy, if he only knew. And Judah said, bring her out. Let her be burned. See what I mean? His moral compass is, this is wrong. He just doesn't realize he's the perpetuator of the wrong. And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law. So she knows what she's doing. The man to whom these belong, I'm pregnant. And she said, please identify whose they are. The signet or signet ring and the cord and the staff. Wow, Judah's whole world caves in. He immediately recognizes them as his, and he says she is more righteous. Hebrew word sadiq. She has conformed to a standard that I have failed in. She's more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not know her. Again, isn't it interesting that earlier we're using phrases like, go into and take, which sounds sensual and selfish. Now it says he did not yada. He did not know her. That's the word that celebrates the fullness of marriage the way God wants it to be celebrated. To know, Adam knew his wife and she conceived. So again, there was no more of a relationship. If all 3 sons are gone, now Shelah of course just wasn't in this part, but if all 3 sons are gone and he only had 3 sons, then according to ancient law, it would be his responsibility to father some children through her and to make sure that her needs were provided. But of course, Shelah is off to the side. So he did not know her again. He is convicted deep in his soul. Well, how can God do anything with this? What's going to happen with this story? Well, you remember, somebody's pregnant. So verse 27, when the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. Oh, you see, what goes around comes around. Same kind of thing. Jacob and, his family. And so same kind of thing taking place here. Isaac and Rebekah. You have Jacob and Esau. Same thing here. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand. Well, if the hand comes out first, that's not the way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be a head coming out first. And the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread. Now, I don't want to get too weird on you here. But again, do we have the gospel in nugget form in various other places of the Bible? Scarlet thread? Why not just any old green piece of thread for St. Patrick's Day? Why not? No, scarlet thread. And there is this scarlet thread of redemption that seems to run through the Bible. Don't want to make too much of that. Don't want to just spiritualize it. But anyway, tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, this is the baby, these babies very active in the womb, trying to be born. Behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you've made for yourself." So the boys are upside down. And the word Perez actually means breach. Therefore, his name was Perez. And afterward, his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand. There's that little, and his name was called Zerah, which means brightness. Okay, a few notes about this. I already mentioned about the time factor and the word for immorality. Judah is caught red-handed, just like King David, 2 Samuel 11 and 12, Psalm 51, Psalm 32. The good news is he doesn't try to justify himself. There would be no more intimacy between he and Tamar. The babies are reminiscent of Jacob and Esau, and you see the meaning of their names there. This is quite a strange chapter. Kind of an ugly chapter, a difficult chapter. After several difficult chapters, Esau, chapter 36, all his descendants, all those names. Chapter 37, Joseph, even though he probably should have shut his big trap about his dreams, that didn't help advance his cause. Nonetheless, difficulty. He ends up in Egypt. Chapter 38, Judah and Tamar, sexually difficult chapter. But that will be in contrast to the chapter for the next time. And that's Genesis 39, where Joseph will be noble. Here are some applications to think through. Number one, staying in Christian community can help our moral compass. Now, we can't just be isolated. We've been sent into the world to be the light of the world. So we've got to have interaction with non-believers. And yet, 1 Corinthians 15 says that bad company corrupts good morals. 1 Thessalonians 5 says, avoid the very appearance of evil. When Judah goes off to another place and doesn't stay in the family of faith, he got in trouble. Which brings me to the second one, and that's this. Guard against cultural indoctrination. It's so subtle. It comes by the TV waves. We can just buy into stuff and laugh at things before that we would never have bought into or laughed about years ago. So be careful. Always guard against cultural indoctrination. Thirdly, marry inside the context of faith. It's good for teach our kids this, teach our grandkids this. Marry in the context of faith. That's always the best advice. Can God redeem other parts of people's lives that way? Sure. Of course. I mean, look at Ruth and Boaz, a Moabitess and an Israelite. So he can, but as a general rule, better to do it the other way. Number 4, follow your created conscience and God's law. Even before the Mosaic law was given, these people had a sense of right and wrong and were following what they knew to be right. That if a guy's kid dies, then his brother does something here. Way before law came, there was that. So God made us with a conscience, a moral umpire to call the balls and strikes of life. Follow it. Number 5, when convicted by your own sin, own it. Don't try to write it off. Don't try to just explain it away. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't dismiss it. Don't diminish it. When you are convicted, as Judah was, he said, she's been more righteous than me. And she dressed up as a cult prostitute. Lastly, this. Be open to the saving power of God coming through the ugliness of sin. These two little boys, these twin boys, didn't do anything wrong. The wrong was committed elsewhere. But through these boys would come the line that would lead us to Jesus. And so here's the strange part. Of the women in the genealogy of Jesus, Tamar is the first woman's name. It's Tamar's name who occurs first of the women in the genealogy. And she bears twins. And the point of these twins is God's redemptive plan is still alive and working. And what the good news is that Judah will later really get that. He will make that substitutionary, atoning kind of speech that will trip the trigger for Joseph, and Joseph will reveal himself to his brothers, and he will say, come down to Egypt, let me provide for you, because the famine's going to get worse. So it's all part of God's redemptive plan, and I think it says to us again, once again, that God can hit a straight lick with a crooked stick. That's Genesis 38. It is clearly the theme, a black sheep, which in this case is Judah, in the good shepherd's heritage. I hope that helps you. You read it again, study again, and next time we're together to study, though actually the next Wednesday night will be our congregational meeting where we deal with our budget for the new year. But when we come again to study, we will be in Genesis 39 with Joseph, the handsome young man who's risen to power in Egypt. Thank you.